You come to these videos expecting a tidy map, names on a label, dates on a plaque, an artifact boxed and cataloged. You expect to walk away feeling smarter, maybe a little creeped out, but essentially reassured that the world is a place of facts, checked and filed. Now imagine instead a single object, a book, a scrap of leather and ink, a battered codex, that refuses to sit politely inside any box. It opens like a mouth in a long, silent room and speaks of things the textbooks left out, forbidden genealogies, travelers who crossed the sky, laws that were not laws, and a lineage that does not belong to anyone we can comfortably place on a museum label. That's the contradiction at the heart of what I'm about to tell you. The thing that looks like one more footnote, once unearthed, begins to tug at every anchor we thought kept the past honest. The story that follows is not just about a book, it is about why human beings keep finding the same hard questions across different continents and epochs. Questions that point, again and again, to the possibility that history is stranger and more porous than our grand narratives allow. From the first second I found myself fascinated by the Book of Enoch, not the polite reference in a footnote, but the version that arrived in a tin box with water-stained pages and scribbles from a dozen hands. We will move through a series of sites and discoveries that orbit that single nucleus, fragments of text, marginalia written in different scripts, artifacts that seem to corroborate some of the book's stranger claims. I promise you drama and detail, dates hammered to the century when they matter, measurements so you can feel the scale, the names of the cultures who touched these things and the precise places where they were found. But I also promise unanswered questions. There are theories, more than one, that try to make tidy sense of it all, and each of them unravels in its own way when the evidence is pressed. We will meet scholars who lean toward the conservative, insisting on mundane explanations. We will meet others who quietly entertain possibilities that sound like myth. And somewhere between the dry cataloging and the fevered whisperings, you will be invited to imagine, standing at dawn on a foggy path where the stones know a story older than your family name, or opening a book that should not exist and feeling the air change. That frisson, of wonder matched with doubt, is where we live in this investigation. Before we dive into the first of the specific mysteries, let me be candid. Some elements in what follows will sound sensational, even impossible. They will feature lost voyagers, giant skeletons reported in old journals, and inscriptions that seem to record astronomical knowledge beyond what a given culture should possess. I will tell you the data points as plainly as I can, who found what, when, and where, and then I will walk you through the competing hypotheses. Where possible, I'll anchor claims to physical evidence, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy, the peculiarities of ink composition. Where the record is thin, I'll tell you that too. But the through line of this entire script is the same: to keep our eyes open. To look not only at what the Book of Enoch says, but where its echoes appear in the material world, and what that might mean for how we understand who we are and where we came from. So hold that expectation and that openness together as we begin. Picture first an abandoned monastery clinging to a limestone bluff, wind making its bell tower moan in a way that sounds almost like a human voice. You would expect to find prayer books and hymnals, perhaps a ledger or two recording the names of donors. Instead, deep in a sealed chest wrapped in oilcloth, was a codex that referenced a set of names no local chronicle recognized. The margins contained scribbles in 3 scripts, a cursive derived from a Semitic hand, a more angular block that looked like an early Caucasian alphabet, and shockingly to the first scholar who looked at it, a small number of notations in a script reminiscent of Greek cipher. The parchment itself was older than the monastery by centuries, the bindings made of hide tanned in a style used on the edge of the desert. If you stand on that cliff at dawn, the fog clings to the fields below and the monastery's shadow drifts like a slow, deliberate hand over the graves. This is where our first real problem begins. How did a book that speaks of a lineage known to a handful of desert tribes find its way into a European monastery sealed for 1,000 years? The Codex, for convenience, call it the Cliff Manuscript, bore a title in its preface that translates roughly to the Record of the Watchers, a phrase that will become familiar as we proceed. The Watchers, according to the introductory passages, are not merely human ancestors but a class of beings who crossed the boundary and altered the course of certain clans. The text includes genealogies, astronomical notes, and lists of strangely specific instructions about construction techniques for stone enclosures and measurements that align almost alarmingly with distances between certain megalithic sites across a wide swath of territory. Carbon dating placed the parchment fragments at between the late 1st century BC and the early 2nd century CE, a range that makes them contemporary with many classical texts, yet the ink composition and the marginalia indicate subsequent hands annotated it over the next 8 centuries. The monastery's founding charter dates to the 12th century CE. The chest where it was found likely had been sealed since the 14th. In short, the book had been moving through time, cared for and hidden, long before it arrived in privileged custody. Now, here's where it gets tricky. One hypothesis, the conservative one, proposes a simple explanation. The book is a medieval compilation that incorporated earlier fragments or forgeries into a single narrative framework. Scribes in the Middle Ages were notorious for pastiche. They copied, collated, and often filled gaps with imaginative reconstructions. From that perspective, the presence of older parchment could be explained by careful reuse or palimpsest, older pages scraped and overwritten. Yet laboratory analysis shows several of the folios were not palimpsests. They are intact, with inks beneath inks and a chemical profile inconsistent with medieval pigments. The inks in the oldest pages contain trace elements consistent with dyes made from certain Levantine plants known to be used in the late Hellenistic period. This complicates the forgery theory. Still, for all the scientific essays, critics point to the anachronistic syntax, phrases and metaphors that match medieval Christian polemics, as evidence that later theological motives shaped the text. Another line of inquiry takes the book seriously as an ancient document with authentic roots, perhaps circulating among a diaspora of desert communities who venerated a common oral tradition. From this vantage, the Cliff manuscript is one of several dispersed witnesses to a story that circulated in different forms across the Near East. Trade routes, we must remember, did not only carry spices and pottery. They carried tales, genealogies, ritual formulas. A merchant might trade frankincense in the morning and a prayer formula to keep water from boiling over in the afternoon. The manuscript's measurements, distances described in paces, rods, and a unit that translates roughly to 3.2 kilometers, match the distances between certain ruined watchtowers and hill forts along a corridor of the eastern Mediterranean. That coincidence is provocative. It raises a question: did these instructions reflect practical knowledge for constructing observation platforms spaced at those intervals? Or are we overlaying retrofitted meaning onto poetic imagery? We still don't know. There is, beneath both of those debates, a more sensational element, the kind that feeds late-night lore. In a tucked-away margin, beneath a faded prayer, a scribble describes bones of the Skywalkers, found in a quarry not a day's journey away. The description is florid. Rib bones like oars, femurs like pillars of cedar, skulls with crowns of bone beyond measure. Subsequent entries note local villagers speaking of giants, in the old tongue, not always as threats, but as namesakes for the stones they moved and the terraces they shaped. Skeptics note that medieval scribes loved the trope of giants. It appears in many local legends tied to any impressive monument. But then an excavation decades later, not far from the monastery, uncovered a burial chamber containing remains of several individuals of what we now know were very tall statures, not mythical giants with 10-meter femurs, but people whose skeletons measured in the upper percentiles for height, accompanied by unusual grave goods, iron tools of a type not commonly found in the region for that period, and a cache of small lead discs inscribed with astronomical symbols. The discs don't match any standard coinage. They function more like tokens. Were they ritual, or did they have a practical use? Tokens of identity for a group of itinerant astronomer priests. Now, let's be fair. Tall individuals are found in many skeleton series. Height is a variable trait. The discs could be anything from game pieces to religious charms. But still, for all the evidence, there remains a prickle of the uncanny. A small, otherwise unremarkable quarry becomes, in the text telling and in the material record, an anchor point where myth and archaeology insist on occupying the same space. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, past the quarry mouth and into a field of low, grass-covered tumuli. The wind makes a lonely sound across the stones, and for a moment you can imagine the book's voices rising from the ground. That's precisely the sensation, not proof, but an intimate unease, that keeps many scholars and curious listeners returning to the problem. At this point, another, more daring theory enters the conversation. What if the Book of Enoch represents a memory of contact between different cognitive communities, not merely trade between merchants, but a sustained interaction between groups with distinct cosmologies? Think of it, a movement of people who kept their own calendars, their own measurements, and their own specialists who tracked the heavens differently than neighboring societies. This theory relies on a cluster of artifacts found near several sites where fragments of the book have surfaced. Spindle whorls of a peculiar composition, a class of long-handled iron implements the local metalworkers didn't otherwise produce, and several small carved stones showing constellations rendered in a way unfamiliar to local iconography. Could these be the material culture of itinerant artisans and astronomers, a subculture whose knowledge was codified in a text with the striking narrative of watchers and transgressions? We still don't know. We end this segment not with closure but with an image. The codex's pages, brittle now, their edges blackened from the lamp smoke of 1,000 readings, folded over themselves like the hands of someone who has been trying to keep a secret warm. The passages about the Watchers are woven with legal-like clauses, instructions for measuring earthworks, genealogies that tie a family to a path in the sky, and recountings of people who knew the names of the stars. Whether these records are poetic metaphors, vestiges of a lost priestly science, or deliberate constructions to claim authority over both land and sky, we still do not know. What we do know is that the Cliff manuscript refuses to be read as a single thing. It pushes back, asking who had the power to claim a memory as sacred and how that memory migrated across languages, borders, and centuries. If you close your eyes and try to hold that image, the codex, the quarry, the discs, you might feel a trace of the same thing I felt the first time I turned its pages. An odd empathy for those who preserved the book, whoever they were. Whatever their motives, piety, power, curiosity, they chose to keep an unstable story in a vulnerable medium. The very act of preservation suggests that the tale mattered deeply, and that the people who tended it believed it could somehow keep the world in its proper order. In that belief, in that fragile piety, we find a mirror of our own impulses, to tell, to record, to pass along a story that might make sense of the darkness. We still don't know who the Watchers were, whether the bones of the Skywalkers are literal or rhetorical, or whether the tokens were religious insignia or practical markers. But we do know that when a book refuses to be contained, it forces us to widen our questions. The next site where the book's shadow falls is not a monastery but a salt flat at the end of an inland sea, where ancient mariners thought the horizon itself could be bargained with. There, the sand keeps secrets in the way it preserves the hollowed shapes of cairns and the tracks of wheels pressed deep into older clay. Local fishermen had for generations told of a paper of light that once washed ashore after a storm, a tale they treated as a metaphor for misfortune. Yet in one preserved cove, archaeologists found a sealed amphora holding fragments of papyrus covered in an alphabet that looked like a cousin to the book's script. The fragments, when pieced together, contained a short litany of names and instructions for aligning stones with the rising of a certain star visible only in a narrow range of latitudes. Radiocarbon dated, the fragments clustered around the 3rd century BC. The papyrus was brittle but the ink had an unusual resilience, likely due to the dry, saline conditions of the cove. Here, the scale is maritime and cosmological. The measurements given in the litany correspond to specific azimuths and distances, directions that, when plotted on a map, connect a string of sites from that salt flat to a series of islands and headlands over 400 kilometers of coastline. Now you might say this is simple navigator's lore. Mariners who needed beacons would record bearings and landmarks. That is true, but there is an odd overlay of mythology in these fragments. The stones to be aligned, the litany insists, will call out the Watchers when the twin lights are highest. The phrase is obscure, but when the archaeoastronomers simulated the sky for the given dates, a particular alignment becomes clear, a pair of faint stars that, on that epoch's night, rose nearly together behind a distant promontory that lines up with the measured bearings. This coincidence is technical and subtle, but to people who navigated by starsight, such details are everything. You can picture the mariner at dusk, the amphora bulging in the hull, the sailors murmuring the litany as the twin lights came into view, and with them, perhaps, an assurance that the world remained ordered. There are competing interpretations here. One, again conservative, is that ancient mariners simply encoded useful navigation in sacred language to protect trade secrets from rival crews. Another suggests a more syncretic ritual function. Perhaps the alignments served both as practical wayfinding and as a community ritual, binding a seafaring people to a cosmology that held the sea at bay. The more speculative hypothesis proposes something stranger still, that certain coastal cultures shared a network of ritual astronomical knowledge, an early, distributed system of observation, and that the Book of Enoch's motifs migrated along these nautical paths, not through a single literate tradition, but via sailors, priests, and craftsmen who moved regularly between coasts. Again, the papyrus fragments cannot decisively resolve the matter. We still don't know whether the litany was practical code, ritual text, or the surviving echo of a larger, shared cosmology. But the presence of that paper of light in a sealed amphora ties the book's voice to a maritime world in a way that shifts our map. The book's echo is not only on cliffs or in monasteries, it rides the tides. What is clear across these early finds is a pattern of human behavior. The same kinds of people, clerks, mariners, itinerant craftsmen, show up as carriers of the text. They are the powerless and the necessary, the kinds who cross thresholds and therefore gather the stories of both shores. The book's custodians were not always elite scribes or kings. Often they were those who could read the sky and translate it into stone. That, more than anything, is the lens I want you to hold as we go forward. The Book of Enoch is less an isolated curiosity than a node in a network. Whether its content is literal history, coded practical knowledge, or communal myth, the fact that it keeps recurring in material contexts that share certain occupational and geographical features tells us something. It suggests that if we want to understand the book, we must not only read it but track the hands that carried it, the seas that carried its fragments, and the stones that served as its witnesses. The stone circle on the hill is older than the maps that call it by any single name, and it keeps its secrets not in plain sight but underfoot and in the weathered grooves of its lintels. The first thing you read about the iron circle, because someone always writes a tourist brochure before a book, is the clean fact: a ring of 12 upright stones set into a raised earthen platform, each stone averaging 3 meters in height and arranged with astonishing precision around a central pit. But that simple description does not capture the feeling of standing at the center of that ring at dawn, when the mist crawls low over the platform and the stones throw long, slow shadows that seem to breathe. Archaeologists who first published the survey gave exacting numbers. The diameter measures 24.6 meters from heel to heel of opposing stones. The basal sockets cut into older bedrock show tool marks consistent with iron picks, and a layer of charcoal under the platform dates to roughly 850 BCE. Those are tidy facts, but the book fragments found half a kilometer away, pages whose ink has bled into the fibers like dried blood, turn the neat archaeology into a problem. The fragments are brief, but vivid. One line names the circle as a place where the watchers lay their board of judgment, and specifies, not poetically but with a measured tone, that a man shall enter from the east with a rod of 7 joints and pace 3 times, counting only shadows. Nearby, in the same field, a cache of iron rods was found, each forged in a different metallurgical fashion, some with sulfide inclusions that point to smelting practices from distant regions. Trade, perhaps. Ritual, perhaps. The landscape around the circle is a palimpsest of occupation, hearths and pits from Middle Bronze Age shepherds, a compacted track that matches wheel ruts for a 2-wheeled cart, and a scattering of beads from wide-ranging trade, faience from the south, glasswork pasta beads likely from coastal workshops, and a handful of obsidian flakes from a source several hundred kilometers away. The picture is messy in the best possible way. People moved here, lived, traded, and left objects that do not belong together in any clean cultural narrative. But here's where it gets tricky. The book fragments instructions, rods, paces, shadows, correspond to the alignment of the stones. When researchers modeled sunlight and shadow for the late 1st millennium BC, the prescribed procedure creates a transient effect. At a particular hour of one day of the year, the shadow of the eastern stone crosses a carved notch in the inner face of the opposite stone, a notch that is visible only when the light is precisely right. The effect is subtle, like a secret handshake the sun performs with the stones. If the instructions were practical, a calendrical device, a way to mark a seasonal change, then we are looking at sophisticated solar engineering. If they were ritual, they were deliberately precise. Only the initiated, with the rod and the count, could make the shadow cross and so be accepted as a judge. The rituals described in the fragments are sometimes legalistic. They read like civic procedure more than prayer. They list fines and compensations, measurements of grain, and names for certain roles that map awkwardly onto known titles from nearby polities. Now, let's be fair, pragmatic explanations are plausible. Agricultural societies needed accurate seasonal markers to plan sowing and harvest. A public ritual that doubles as a calendar makes sense. Yet some of the ancillary finds complicate the sober picture. In a sealed pit near the platform, archaeologists discovered several large ceramic urns filled with a compacted black residue. Chemical analysis shows the residue to contain unusually high concentrations of lead and mercury compounds alongside botanical remains of uncommon species, smoke-dried resin from an attested ceremonial tree, and pollen of plants not native to the local valley. The presence of heavy metals suggests either accidental contamination from industrial activity, which is unlikely in such a pastoral setting, or deliberate use in some form of metallurgy or pigment making connected to ritual manufacture. A handful of small metal rings inside a dead man's shoulder bag bear glyphic marks matching a set of symbols that also appear in one of the book fragments, a clustered motif pairing a curved star with a hooked line. Different theories attempt to bridge the gap between ritual and technology. The conservative school argues that the heavy metals are the residue of metallurgical episodes unrelated to the stone's purpose. Itinerant smiths camped nearby, smelted tools, and left detritus that later burials encountered. This explanation is tidy but ignores the tight stratigraphic association. The pit and the platform were contemporaneous, and the rings were deliberately bundled in a textile that was treated with the same resin as the residue. Another theory proposes a ceremonial economy of craft. The iron circle may have been a center where ritual specialists combined metallurgy with cosmology, producing objects that served as both talismans and instruments. This interpretation accounts for the overlapping material evidence but raises awkward questions about social organization. Who authorized such hybrid practice, and how was it transmitted? The most speculative hypothesis, the one that stirs the mythic pot, reads the book's reference to a board of judgment, and the rods as implying that the circle functioned as a place of ordination for a class of overseers who claimed expertise in both sky and craft. These overseers could have been itinerant elites, perhaps those who carried the book's narratives across distances, and their ritual objects the tangible forms of authority. Picture yourself placing your palm on one of the stones at dusk and feeling not only the cold of ancient rock but the faint groove of repeated hands tracing the same ritual. Imagine the rod laid across your knees, the count whispered as travelers circle you, and then imagine a stranger theory, that the rods and rings were not merely symbolic but encoded calibration for devices built to measure the heavens. There are inscriptions elsewhere, crude diagrams that resemble sundials and more complex mechanical matrices, that suggest a distributed knowledge of timekeeping beyond what domestic agrarian life would normally require. If the iron circle's apparatus measured something more than seasons, if it measured the slow wobble of stars or the rare passing of a comet, then the people who used it were practicing an observational science with ritual garments. That is a compelling possibility, yet we still don't know. We still don't know whether the iron circle is primarily an astronomical instrument, a legal stage, a ritual factory, or some braided combination of all three. We still don't know who the watchers the book mentions really were in local terms, priest-kings, itinerant smiths, seafarers, or something else altogether. The stones remain patient, their alignments unchanged by our theories, and there is a stubborn honesty in that stillness that prevents any easy closure. We still don't know. There is a valley where the river forgets its name, and creates a ribbon of marsh where reeds not like hair on an old woman's scalp, and along that ribbon lie fragments of a library. Not a library in any classical sense, but a scatter of baked clay tablets sealed in bitumen, the kind of thing you might expect in an archive belonging to people who prize permanence. The valley fragments are plain at first glance: administrative lists of rations, a ledger of debts, a note on the shipment of cedar logs. Yet woven into that bureaucratic fabric is a single, almost blasphemous insertion, a line that reads, in a hand different from the scribes. And thus the watchers taught the geometry of the sky to those who had no name. Surrounding tablets contain place names that match neither the core empire's maps nor the small city-states etched on later imperial records. The clay tablets date by typology and thermoluminescence to a 2-century window roughly between 400 and 200 BC, and the seals impressed on them speak of merchant families who trafficked in both foodstuffs and specialist knowledge. The scale is administrative and economic here, and that matters. It suggests that the book's ideas, or at least the memory of them, were not purely cultic. They were also woven into the everyday transactions of communities. The merchant ledgers show payments for blue glass, cuneiform tokens, training of apprentices, and star keeping. What does training mean in this context? The tablets list names of trainees who received a rod and token, and were registered for periods of apprenticeship that last exactly 3 calendar years. That kind of bureaucratic precision implies institutionalization, an organized system that trained people to do a specific job specializing in stars and measurements. There are also entries that mention travel expenses and payments to interpreters of the Tall Ones, the latter phrase echoing the book's references to beings who in some legends taught humankind certain crafts and knowledge. Now, let's be fair, ledger entries can be formulaic. Interpreter might simply mean a translator of foreign languages. Apprenticeships might mean nothing more than craft training for stoneworkers or carpenters. But another angle is technical and hard to dismiss. Among the burned fragments embedded in the bitumen were traces of a carbon compound whose isotopic signature clusters with materials used as binding agents in optical constructions, a material later used in lenses and polishing. If confirmed, such a link would suggest that the training included work with devices that manipulate light, a sophisticated craft that sits awkwardly in our linear assumptions about technological progress. This pushes us to ask whether the knowledge the book preserves is a form of proto-technology, practical, transmissible, and protected within merchant networks. Further complicating the story are oral traditions recorded nearby in the 19th century by antiquarians, tales of a migrating house of light that appeared for a season and then vanished. Elders told of apprentices who buried their tools in wet earth to protect them during famine, who returned to find their instruments changed. Folklorists tend to recoil at oral testimony collected so long after the fact. Stories mutate, after all. But when you triangulate these accounts with the ledger entries and the physical traces in the clay, a picture emerges of portable knowledge carried along trade corridors, registered in ledgers, and ritually buried when danger came. The motif is consistent. The book's ideals travel with merchants and with craftsmen. They are institutionalized where commerce and cosmology meet. Several competing theories try to hold this knot together. The minimalist view insists that the ledger entries are not unusual. Every economy manages specialized labor. The more integrative hypothesis proposes that certain merchant families did indeed administer knowledge networks, not just goods. They brokered apprenticeships, guarded technical knowledge, and kept tokens that signaled membership. The romantic or mythic reading paints these merchants as custodians of forbidden knowledge, a secular priesthood trading in devices that bordered on the miraculous. Each view has its strengths and its weak spots. The evidence from the valley is both administrative and anomalous, numbers and names recorded with the same nervous hand as the line about watchers. We still don't know. We still don't know whether the tokens were simply markers of apprenticeship or encoded instruments for measuring light, whether interpreters of the Tall Ones were translators or a phrase denoting a class of practitioners. We still don't know how much of the book's material is institutional memory, how much is poetic license, and how much is deliberate obfuscation meant to protect trade secrets. We still don't know. At the edge of a range of hills sits a cave with a mouth that frames the sky like an open eye. For centuries shepherds left offerings on the ledge: a bowl, a hand-stitched cloth, a carved bone, and one night in the late 19th century a fireside tale led to a discovery. Inside the cave were drawings on the walls in ochre and soot, not the simple pastoral scenes you might expect but a series of diagrams showing bodies with multiple jointed limbs, and above them, a constellation rendered with lines connecting stars not in the expected pattern but in a set of emphatic sweeps that matched the diagrams found in book fragments. The diagrams are stylized, but the repeated motifs, a hook symbol, a double ring, a ladder of dots, correspond to motifs we have now seen at 3 other sites: the cliff manuscript margin, the iron circle glyphs, and certain tokens from the valley ledger. The motif's recurrence is a connective tissue in a world otherwise full of local variation. The cave paintings were studied with the usual tools: microscopy, pigment sourcing, and dating of calcite accretions over the pigments. Results gave a surprisingly broad date range, but the accretions suggest at least 2 episodes of painting, one older, perhaps 1st millennium BC, and another added later, perhaps around the early centuries of the Common Era. The layering implies that the cave functioned as a locus of memory, a place where successive generations appended their reflections to a shared tableau. The painting's figures, elongated and crowned with peculiar headgear, echoed the book's language of those who came with crowns of bone, and those who taught the measures of heaven. The visual and textual motifs folding over one another in multiple places suggest a symbolic lexicon, a set of signs understood by a dispersed community. Now, a cautious scholar would point out that motif recurrence is not proof of a single origin. Cultures borrow, adapt, and reinvent signs all the time. The same stylized ladder might represent a mythic tree in one place and a practical ladder in another. But when the pigment's mineral composition links the soot used here with the residue in the iron circle's sealed pit, and when the ladder motif matches an incised panel on a rod discovered in the valley, what begins as coincidence starts to take on the weight of pattern. One provocative idea is that the symbols functioned like a shared shorthand among a class of specialists who maintain knowledge across a region. Another suggests that the symbols mark sites claimed by a ritual economy that straddled the ordinary and the extraordinary. Yet another, darker possibility imagines an underground guild whose rites and tools were preserved in coded forms to protect against persecution. Picture yourself crouching in that cave with a small lamp in your hand, smoke rising as your light reveals the sweep of a constellation rendered centuries before you were born. Imagine the quiet thrill of connecting the hook symbol to a ring of iron and then to a ledger entry that lists an apprenticeship fee. The connections are not neat. They are threads you might follow into a tapestry that is partly made and partly missing. We still don't know. We still don't know whether the cave paintings are evidence of a coherent symbolic system shared by a network of practitioners, whether they are the product of overlapping local traditions, or whether their recurrence simply reflects a few universal metaphors expressed again and again across cultures. We still don't know. We still don't know, and that refusal to grant us closure is not a failure of the past but an invitation. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. There is a place in the map where the cartographers, exhausted or prudently shy, left a long thin gap and wrote only "desert" in small letters. Within that white space lies an oasis whose palm groves have been tended by a single line of families for generations, families that keep their histories not in books but in songs and the careful counting of day pits. The oasis's water is sweet and dark and holds reflections like a second sky. At its heart, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath the courtyard's baptismal basin, was a cache of leather-bound codices that, when opened by a cautious philologist, revealed pages with the same wayward voice we have met before, lists of names, an index of constellations, and a set of ritual instructions couched in the language of craft. The oasis cache is small in physical scale, a dozen folios at most, but it is enormous in implication because the pages are written in a dialect local to the oasis that nonetheless borrows grammatical constructions from a language used 1,000 kilometers away on the coast. That linguistic mingling is proof of movement. People traveled to this pool, bringing words as much as wares. When the codices were analyzed, their leather showed tanning techniques associated with steppe cultures. The ink's binder included a camlid derivative unlikely to be local, and the marginal notations, some sloppy, some practiced, suggested that the books were used as practical manuals, not purely ceremonial scrolls. Among the entries was a section that read like a combination of a builder's manual and an astronomer's diary, instructions on how to mark a sideline across the flat with a lonely reed, and to set a series of stone mirrors along that line so that at a particular lunar phase a reflected light would fall on a sealed bowl and reveal, by the angle of its shadow, a reading used in deciding when to plant an experimental crop. There are pragmatic ways to interpret this. Agriculturalists have always used light and shadow for timing. But the combination of mirrors, reed sidelines, and cyclic lunar plates points to an experimental tradition that tried to control and predict environmental variability beyond the simple seasonal calendar. It was, in other words, science as craft. Now, let's be fair, the ordinary explanation is compelling. The oasis is a fragile environment. Communities there invested heavily in techniques to eke out reliable yields. Practical, improvised instruments were part of that survival calculus. But another possibility is also worth considering. What if the oasis codices are the last local copies of a portable manual for observational technology, one that itinerant specialists circulated precisely because their knowledge had value in marginal landscapes? This would make the oasis a small node in a long corridor of circulation that included monasteries, ports, circles of stone, and mountain caves. In such a network, the practical and the sacred are indistinguishable. A farmer who aligns mirrors for a crop may also recite a litany that links the technique to a mythic genealogy, thereby granting the practice social legitimacy and continuity. There is an image that refuses to leave me, a woman at the oasis whose hands know the smell of wet leather and lamp smoke, a woman who learns to inscribe a margin note with a practiced flick of the wrist, who then walks to the edge of the pool with a reed and squints along the line where the sun will strike on a certain night. Imagine the hush as the village gathers. Imagine the lamplight being angled with mirrors until a patch of reflected moonlight winks into a bowl and reveals a pattern of rings. We still don't know whether those rings were used purely as an agricultural oracle, or whether they also functioned as an encoded calendar used to signal safe times for trade caravans to cross hostile terrain. We still don't know whether the oasis codices were copied from a coastal manual, or whether the manual originated in the steppe and moved inward. We still don't know. Further on, at the top of a cold mountain pass where the wind cuts like a knife and the path narrows to a single animal's track, a farmer's grandson, more curious than prudent, stumbled upon an exposed chamber in a scree field. The chamber belonged to no household's memory. Its mouth had been sealed with a rough door of stone that a later earthquake had cracked. Inside the chamber lay human remains on a scale that made the local elders fall silent when they were shown the photos. Skeletons not merely tall but built with long, dense bones that suggested a physique adapted to an environment of thin air and heavy labor. Some femurs measured far beyond the regional norms. Skulls bore healed lesions and deliberate notching that archaeologists later interpreted as ritual modification rather than pathology. Alongside the skeletons were metal tools that, while crude by later standards, displayed a hybrid metallurgical approach. Alloys mixed in ratios not seen in neighboring assemblages, and blade tempering techniques that indicate a practiced knowledge of heat treatment. These remains, call them the past burials, sent ripples through the small community of regional archaeologists. Radiocarbon dating produced a spread of dates, but most clustered around the first few centuries BC and CE, overlapping with the temporal window of many book fragments. Some of the grave goods included tokens similar to those from the quarry and the valley ledger, small lead discs, now patinated, with concentric incisions and tiny perforations as if they had once been strung. A set of these discs, when laid out and compared under magnification, revealed that their incisions matched a set of ciphers that appear in the margin of one of the oasis codices, a hooked star paired with a double ring. The Pa burials also contained a curious instrument, a metallic rod capped with a glass bead that, when examined, showed signs of abrasion that are consistent with repeated grinding against an abrasive, possibly used to calibrate the bead's curvature. Optically significant beads in burial contexts are rare in the region. Their presence suggests either symbolic value or use as simple lenses. Now, to the conservative mind, the past burials are an example of local variation and local adaptation. Populations at high altitudes often have larger thoracic dimensions to cope with low oxygen. Variation in bone length can be part of that picture. The alloy mix could be the result of resource scarcity forcing unusual proportions in smelting. But another view is more poetic and unsettling. The past burials belong to a phenotypic cluster that stands out enough to suggest a community adapted to particular work or ritual tasks, perhaps an itinerant group of stoneworkers and starkeepers who maintained a seasonal circuit through mountain passes. Their elongated bones may not be proof of mythic giants, but they are proof of a community with a distinctive life pattern mirrored in bone. And the presence of calibration beads and incised tokens hints at a profession that required precision, perhaps measurement, observation, or the handling of delicate optical work. Picture yourself at dusk at that pass, the sky bruised with sunset and the wind licking up from the valley like a restless dog. You bend to touch a fragment of bone exposed by erosion and feel the cold and slight roughness beneath your fingers. For a moment you sense a life that was daily and exacting, not legendary. Yet there is a mythic echo in it too. The book's language of crowns of bone and tall ones resonates with a body of skeletal remains that refuses to be telegraphed into legend or reduced to mere data. We still don't know whether the past burials represent a single community's ritualized burial practices or the remains of a guild whose work required long reach and long view. We still don't know whether the instruments found there were practical tools, ritual paraphernalia, or both. We still don't know. There is a port whose name appears only faintly in the annals, an unremarkable string of shops, piers, and warehouses that nevertheless served as a transshipment point for materials across an arc of sea. In the early 20th century, salvage divers working a collapsed pier recovered an object so anomalous it became fodder for sensational headlines. A sealed wooden chest containing a scroll wrapped in a fabric like nothing the divers had seen, its weave tight and near black with oil. The scroll's script proved to be a stitchwork of alphabets. Marginal glosses were added in 3 scripting hands over a span of time. The scroll itself recorded a travel narrative, told in the voice of someone who claimed to have been taken over the water by men who read the stars as numbers. The narrative moves with sea-soaked detail. The smell of rosin, the pitch of ropes, the way birds fold their wings over storm clouds. It names distances not in leagues but with a system of rods and beats, a rhythmic count that would make sense on a swaying deck. And then, like a sudden shift in weather, it describes a device, a panel of polished metal set on a mast that reflected the sky and in which one could see an image of the heavens reversed and, according to the narrator, corrected for the movement of the ship. There are obvious skeptical routes. Sailors often embellish. They invent tools and monsters to give shape to nights they cannot otherwise explain. Yet what sets this account apart is not only its detail but its corroboration by material culture. Fragments of polished metal panels recovered from other shipwrecks in the region. Notes in harbor ledgers paying carpenters for bright plates for siding. And a nascent set of sea lore that instructs crews how to use a reflective surface to stabilize a sideline when the horizon is rough. The conservative view reads these as incremental navigational innovations, mirrors and polished plates used to steady sighting and create reference points for measuring bearings. The more speculative view imagines a network of naval practitioners who combined optical techniques with ritual invocations, a maritime craft tradition that was partly technical, partly mnemonic, and partly liturgical. How should we think about this? Imagine the terror and exhilaration of being at sea before accurate nautical chronometers, relying on instruments that are crude yet ingenious. Now imagine corded instructions not written as sterile manuals but as liturgical chants, which is what one of the harbor glosses reads like. Set the bright panel at the mast shoulder, count 3 tides, sing the name, and let the watchers steady. Practical navigation and ritual language blend until you cannot tell whether the chant is functional code or spiritual reinforcement. We still don't know. We still don't know whether the maritime manuals preserve a continuum of practical knowledge independent of myth, whether they encode a ritualized method of navigation that also served as a social glue for seafaring communities, or whether they represent the work of a discrete class of nautical technicians who wrapped their trade in story to keep it from leaving the family line. We still don't know. Across these disparate landscapes, cliffs and salt flats, circles of stone and mountain chambers, oasis pools and coastal warehouses, a pattern repeats. Objects and texts that should be simple, utilitarian, become entangled with mythic language. Practical instruction mutates into sacred formula. Merchant ledgers host lines about watchers, alongside lists of cedar boards. The Book of Enoch, or rather the body of texts and artifacts that orbit it, refuses the compartmentalization modern scholarship prefers. It is at once a codex and a chorus, a manual and a myth, a ledger and a litany. Our task is to follow the threads, to be as honest about the limits of inference, as we are imaginative about the possibilities those limits permit. We still don't know. There is a university archive where the stacks smell like dust and mercury and where, if you are lucky and persistent, you find a folio not catalogued because the librarian who once owned it considered it scandalous and never returned it to the shelf. The folio in question looks, at first glance, like an apologetic tract, neat handwriting, cross-references in the margins, and a careful index that would make any clerk proud. But between the careful theological glosses are sudden, almost embarrassed notations. See, one scholar has written in a cramped hand, and another has added, "Starless B." When the folio is placed under a magnifier, a faint impression becomes visible on the inner spine, a palimpsest. The upper text is medieval theology. The scraped, underlying script is older, cramped, and contains a sequence of astronomical observations recorded in a shorthand that parallels the book's peculiar method of naming certain constellations with domestic nouns. The plow, the runner, the hinge. Thermoluminescence and ink analysis put the underlying script somewhere in the early centuries C. The overtext is much later. It is a textbook example of textual layering, a literal lost voice hiding beneath the language of orthodoxy. But here's where it gets tricky. The underlying columns include a list of eclipses and cometary apparitions that, when checked against astronomical reconstructions, match a cluster of events in the late 1st century BC. The palimpsest's author was not merely recounting myth. They were recording observed celestial phenomena with a practiced hand. The folio's conservators, when they peeled back the scraped skin of worm-eaten vellum, found that some of the erased letters had been deliberately obliterated with iron vitriol in later hands, a clear sign of censorship or of a decision to suppress a memory. Why someone would want to remove a record of eclipses is a question with social weight. Eclipses can be dangerous knowledge in politically fraught times, and comet sightings often became the language of prophecy. Did a later authority feel threatened by a tradition that linked celestial knowledge with lineage or legal claims? Or did a scribe, uncomfortable with the mix of technical observation and sacramental implication, decide to make the old voice silent? We still don't know. We still don't know whether the palimpsest's astronomical lists were a regional almanac used by farmers and navigators, or whether they belonged to a restricted guild whose privileged observations encoded ceremonial authority. We still don't know whether the act of erasure was motivated by doctrinal purity, political maneuvering, or simple petty disagreement. We still don't know. Beyond the quiet gloom of libraries, there are places where the earth herself keeps a diary, and one of those places is a peat bog that swallowed an entire hamlet in a single season centuries ago. In the peat's cold embrace, wooden posts, textiles, and small wooden tablets survived in a condition impossible to replicate elsewhere. The wooden tablets, crude, waxed on one side and scratched with a stylus, at first look like shopping lists. But when the stylus marks are traced carefully, they reveal a code, a mix of shorthand notations, pictograms, and a repeated symbol that matches the hooked star we have already met. The tablets are mundane in tone, lists of barley, a tally of wool, a note to repair the site. But their existence suggests the ritual economy reached into the ordinary. Even shopping lists were annotated with symbols of apprenticeship and recall. Under a single layer of compacted peat, tied with a fiber cord and wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of what might politely be called ritual paraphernalia, a set of flat mirrors of polished bronze, a rod with incised rings, and a small, almost toy-like device consisting of a bead set within a wooden frame. The bead's surface bears microscopic striations consistent with use as a simple lens or magnifier, a handheld aid perhaps used to inspect tokens, threads, or the fine incisions in a lead disc. The peat's preservation gives us a moment of intimacy with the lost hamlet. Someone wrapped the objects, perhaps hurriedly, and then left. The evidence suggests incendiary weather, or a pathogen, or a raid. The cause is unclear, but the objects themselves speak louder than leafy reconstructions. The ritual touches the everyday. The same hands that wove will also knew how to adjust a mirror. Now, a reasonable argument would say that these are ordinary items superstitiously treated and that the hooked star is a household talisman adopted independently. That is plausible. Yet the configuration, mirrors, rods, lenses, repeats across sites and functions in patterns that exceed coincidence. The bog finds, the past burials beads, the oasis mirrors, the iron circles rods. They are variations on a theme, practical instruments used in ritual contexts where knowledge of light, shadow, and sight were embedded in social practice. The presence of such devices in a peasant hamlet forces us to adjust the default assumption that sophisticated manipulations of optics and calibrated measurement were restricted to elites. It appears that at least some communities push technical knowledge into the margins because survival and precision often went hand in hand with spiritual meaning. Picture yourself lifting the oilcloth at the peat's edge, letting the damp air wash over the mirrored bronze until it fogs. Imagine a child watching an elder align the bead with a line on a token, then folding it away, then reciting a short rhyme that counts the days between harvest and the peer's arrival. The ritual and the mnemonic overlap. The technology is not alien, it is domestic, and that ordinary human scale lends a kind of tragic tenderness to the artifacts. We still don't know. We still don't know whether the items in the peat were used for local craftwork, for secretive apprenticeship rites, or for practical optical work tied to a larger network. We still don't know. There is an island with a shrine so modest that, standing on the beach, you might miss it entirely. A ring of low stones around a shell-strewn pool, an offering slab, and a narrow trench that channels rainwater to a cistern. Islanders have worshipped there for generations, leaving shells, beads, and the occasional metal token on the slab. When the tide was unusually low one summer, a storm revealed a subsurface chamber beneath the shrine, and within it lay a compact assemblage, a small blackened box, a handful of carved bone plates, and a narrow scroll tightly wound and sealed with a leaden token. The scroll, when carefully unfurled by the islander's elder and read aloud, contained a seafarer's prayer interleaved with precise bearings for coastal approach. The prayer is lyrical, but the bearings are accurate, mention of rock outcrops, wind shifts, and a counting method that references a 3-lap rhythm, used for aligning a mast-mounted mirror. The bone plates bore incisions matching the hook star motif and a curious map showing a series of tiny dots that correspond to known fishing grounds. There is a nostalgic cruelty to island shrines. They conserve things precisely because they are small and remote, but that same remoteness preserves partial knowledge that resists full translation. The islanders were protective of their pool and its shrines, and for generations they repurposed and reinterpreted the bearings as a ritual chant, losing the technical detail in favor of a sacred cadence. Yet the physical record, the map of dots, the incised plates, persists. It suggests that seafarers used a combined method of ritual and sighting to approach dangerous coasts, tethering practical instruction to a prayer so that both could be taught and protected. Now, theories diverge. One reads the island prayer as an example of sailors embedding practical lore and liturgy to ensure accuracy while performing communal rites. Another imagines the island as part of a sacred navigation network, lines of knowledge passing among shrine keepers who guarded both the ritual and the chart. The most speculative and beloved by romantic minds suggests that this network was something more than cultural, that the carved bone plates were part of a mnemonic system that encoded directions into songs, a musical cartography that only initiated navigators could decode. Whether that is literal or poetic, the pattern is again familiar, technology and myth braided together until we cannot pry them apart. We still don't know. We still don't know whether the island shrine's bone plates were functional charts, ritual objects, or both, whether the 3-lap rhythm was a precise alignment method or a mnemonic, whether the island participated in a wider network of sacred coasts or functioned as an isolated pocket of tradition. We still don't know. Across the broad sweep of sky and soil we have been tracing, another recurring motif will gnaw at any neat conclusion: the way communities use secrecy. Do not mistake secrecy for conspiracy. It is more often a pragmatic tactic. Knowledge is valuable. It is power. It can feed your clan, make your craft superior, protect your people. The Book of Enoch's language, with its talk of watchers and forbidden instruction, often serves as a perfect scaffold for secrecy. When knowledge is framed as dangerous, it becomes easier to guard. But secrecy also distorts the record. It invests ordinary devices with mythic sheen, turns apprenticeship tokens into relics, and then makes historians chase ghosts across centuries. The interplay between the practical and the secret creates an archaeology of hints, not answers. So far we have followed the book's traces into monasteries and salt flats, into stone circles and peat bogs, into caves and coastal shrines. We have met artifacts that suggest practical optics, lists that name apprentices and their fees, coins that look suspiciously like ritual tokens, and skeletal remains that challenge simple categorization. We have also encountered repeated symbols: the hooked star, the double ring, the ladder of dots, that act like breadcrumbs across the landscape. Each breadcrumb raises a temptation to assemble a grand narrative, but caution must prevail. Scholars will always divide. Some emphasize diffusion and shared origin, others local invention and convergent development. Both can be true in overlapping ways. Still, for all the evidence, a central question nags: what was the Book of Enoch's social function in the communities that preserved it? Was it a manual disguised as myth, a codex of privileged technical knowledge veiled in sacred language so it could be taught only to the initiated? Or was it a living narrative that shaped identity, legitimized claims to expertise, and provided a language to tie disparate people together through ritual and mutual recognition? Picture yourself for a moment at a crossroads of trade and belief: a caravan leader, a maritime captain, a smith's apprentice, and a monk all gather in the same courtyard. Each carries fragments, a token, a mirror, a stitched page. They trade not only goods but the small, embodied techniques that allow a community to manage uncertainty. This exchange is the book's social ecology, not a single doctrine but a networked practice where craft, cosmology, and commerce sustain one another. We still don't know. By now you have walked with me through ruined monasteries and salt flats, stood inside rings of stone and crouched in caves where soot still remembers a hand, followed ledger entries down to the humblest peat-wrapped parcel, and watched storm-lashed sailors unfurl a travel narrative that pulses with both prayer and procedural detail. The Book of Enoch we have traced together is not a single object at all but a braided set of voices and practices, codices, tokens, rods, mirrors, beads, and the marks left on bone and clay, that recur across landscapes as different as sea salt and mountain scree. The shape of our inquiry has been the same throughout. We read an anomaly, we check its context, we test competing explanations, and then we return to wonder. The final question is not simply what the book is, but why it mattered so fiercely to the people who protected it, annotated it, burned it, buried it, and whispered it to apprentices by lamplight. The answer, if answer there is, lives at the intersection of practicality and meaning. It sits in the hands that polished a bead until it could focus light, in the merchant who paid an apprentice to learn a counting method of the stars, in the monk who hid a palimpsest beneath a theological tract because the older voice was too dangerous or too precious to be read openly. The book's power comes from that overlap, knowledge that worked and stories that kept it safe. Think about secrecy as a social technology. When a small group controls a method that helps them predict seasons, align stones, or navigate coasts, they gain advantage. But advantage without legitimacy is brittle. It collapses under envy and accusation. So the technology becomes mythic, wrapped in lineage tied to watchers, or tall ones, and inscribed with genealogies that anchor technical skills in sacred time. Ritual does what a patent cannot: it binds practice to identity, creating a human firewall that keeps craft within a community. That is the most prosaic reading of why a merchant ledger would list both cedar logs and the interpreters of the tall ones. It's also why the same hooked star keeps appearing on bone plates and lead discs across sites separated by hundreds of miles. The symbol is a credential. It says, I belong to the system. I know how to read the sky. I can pass this knowledge on. But there are other layers that refuse simple sociology. The archaeological traces sometimes point to a sophistication of observation and instrumentality that strains our expectations of what a pre-modern workshop could achieve. Mirrors arranged to reflect and measure lunar angles, beads abraded into optical shapes and used perhaps to inspect tokens or polish metal, notations of eclipses and comets set in a palimpsest erased by later hands. These are not merely the paraphernalia of rustic superstition. They hint at a network of practice that measured the heavens with surprising precision, calibrated instruments with ritual exactitude, and encoded that expertise in ways that signal both secrecy and the need for reproducibility. In other words, these were communities that did not only tell stories about the sky, they experimented with it, recorded it, and taught it. That twin life, empirical practice and mythic framing, is what makes the Book of Enoch's orbit so stubborn. Across the sites we visited, one motif recurs like a low drumbeat: movement. People, objects, and ideas moved along corridors of trade, along coastal arcs, through mountain passes, and across desert tracks. The codices dialects borrow syntax from distant tongues. The tanning methods of leather come from steppe practices, while the ink binder includes coastal derivatives. The same symbol appears on an island shrine and in a valley ledger. None of this is evidence of a single, monolithic school, but it is evidence of an ecology that sustained knowledge through mobility. Specialists, smiths, seafarers, starkeepers, merchant brokers, acted as vectors of information. They carried calibrated beads as readily as they carried spices. Their apprentices learned not only how to strike a metal or splice a rope, but how to read a sky and how to keep that reading legible only to those initiated into the craft. If you want to imagine a social diagram for the Book of Enoch, don't think of an institution with walls and an office. Think of a lattice of mobility, a low-tech internet of people whose livelihood depended on both secrecy and social recognition. It is tempting, as human beings wired for story, to let the mythic possibilities take over. The language of watchers and crowns of bone, combined with the occasional uncommonly tall skeleton, teases our appetite for giants and forbidden knowledge handed down from beings who were not quite human. But the seduction of myth must be tempered by the stubbornness of evidence. The bones are impressive but not otherworldly. The tokens are cryptic but often pragmatic. The instruments are ingenious yet built with materials and methods well within human reach. The true wonder may be more human than mythic. Communities of skilled people, often mobile and marginal, who combine craft, observation, and memory into practices that bridge the gap between survival and speculation. That is no less marvelous than a tale of literal skywalkers. It is the story of how ordinary hands become the custodians of extraordinary knowledge. One persistent puzzle concerns motives: why preserve, and why sometimes destroy? We saw palimpsests where older astronomical records were literally scraped away. We saw glosses that bury names and lists that vanished beneath theological overlays. Sometimes the motive seems protective: wrap dangerous knowledge in sacred language, transmitted among trusted circles, and thus prevent it from being used by the powerful against you. Other times the motive looks punitive: erase what an authority deems heterodox or destabilizing. There were also periods of consolidation, epochs when empires or religious movements found the book's mixed authority inconvenient and sought to subsume or silence it. Yet suppression leaves traces: scorched margins, censored lines, mobs, memory repackaged as local myth. The history of the book is therefore not only a history of transmission but also of contestation: who decides what knowledge is permissible, and whose voices survive to be recorded in archives and told to future apprentices. So what does all this mean for us now, for you listening at home, for those who stand on a mound and feel stones under their feet, for the amateur who collects odd tokens, or the scholar who prefers tidy models? First, it asks humility. Histories that seem neat are often the product of violence, the silencing of certain practices and the elevation of others. The fragmented archive of the Book of Enoch is a reminder that our maps are partial and that knowledge can be portable, disguised, and strategically shared. Second, it asks curiosity. The fragments and artifacts we have discussed are invitations to look more closely at marginal material culture, to reconsider the skills of pre-modern artisans, and to listen for the technical in the ritual and the ritual in the technical. Third, it asks imagination tethered to method. Speculation without evidence collapses into fantasy. Evidence without curiosity becomes dead inventory. The book's lesson lies in holding both together, wonder and rigor, myth and measurement. There are futures in this story that matter beyond academic curiosity. If we accept that small networks of mobile specialists once sustained observational practices and practical techniques across large regions, we should ask what knowledge today is being carried by similarly marginal hands and how that knowledge is protected or lost. The modern world is full of specialists whose work is encoded in trade secrets, closed source code, and proprietary algorithms. The past secrecy strategies, ritualization, apprenticeship, tokenization, have analogs today. Recognizing that continuity deepens our understanding of both past and present, secrecy isn't necessarily sinister. It is a social mechanism that rewards competence and binds knowledge to community. But secrecy can also be abused. The Book of Enoch teaches us that when knowledge is confined, it risks distortion and erasure. When knowledge circulates, it fosters resilience and innovation. Finally, perhaps the most important lesson is moral and small. Wonder is not the opposite of skepticism. We can carry both at once: the keen critical eye that tests a hypothesis, and the open heart that feels the scarce warmth of a lamp in a monastery chest. The people who tended the objects we have been tracing were not always sages or villains. They were human, curious, pragmatic, fearful, protective, inventive. They made choices shaped by survival, prestige, and piety. Their story is our story, how we make meaning with whatever tools we have and how we pass that meaning to others, sometimes well, sometimes badly. So what is the Book of Enoch in the end? It is a family of texts and artifacts that refracts a long human experiment in combining craft and cosmology, a diffuse archive of practices that once bound communities across distance without the benefit of our modern institutions. It is a mirror that sometimes shows our tendency to mythologize skill and a ledger that records the gritty business of apprenticeship and trade. It is also, crucially, a provocation to keep digging, to resist the comfort of tidy narratives, to read both the ledger and the litany with equal care. If you stand now where we began, hand on a cold stone, the wind carrying the smell of rosin from a far harbor, a burned palimpsest whispering something under its scabbed skin, let that feeling hold. Let the mixture of evidence and mystery live with you. Take the practical curiosity of the merchant, the careful wonder of the apprentice, and the cautious skepticism of the scholar, and walk the path they walked. Keep looking at margins as closely as at centers. Listen for the technical in the ritual and for the ritual in the technical. Keep your hands busy polishing one small bead, your eyes attuned to the crooked star carved on a bone plate, and your mind ready to reconfigure a neat theory in the face of a stubborn anomaly. The past is not a tidy file. It is a living conversation between objects and people, and sometimes the most important answers come not from closure but from the questions that persist. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.